I want to welcome everyone to today's ATA webinar presentation, Careers in Translation and Interpreting, and what to do if you want to get one. Thanks to all of you for attending. I have just a few notes before we start. It's a 60-minute presentation, and we do expect to be pretty much on time, despite the late start. ATA certified translators will earn 1 hour of continuing education credit for their participation today, but since this is a how to get into translation and interpreting, I'm not expecting too many of you. The webinar is being recorded, so don't get all panicked if you miss a particular point. You'll get a link to the recording by email within the next 24 hours. You'll also have the recording available on demand from the ATA website. So you can go back anytime and review this. All attendees are muted. This is always a big thing. People say, why can't I talk? But we found that the best way to keep things going, to keep the presentation moving smoothly, is to have everyone muted. But you're going to want to ask questions, and we like that. So look for your question box on your screen. Throughout the webinar, you can type questions in there, and we'll have a question-answer session at the end. Now, more than likely, we're not going to have time to answer everyone's questions, but we'll get to as many as we have time for. So send us your questions. The presenters have also prepared a resource handout for today's webinar. You'll get that link in your follow-up email as well, and it's also on the Careers webinar page on the ATA website. And with that, I'd like to turn today's presentation over to John Shackley. He's stepping in for Jeff right now. And
I'm here.
Oh, good. Jeff's there. I'm turning the presentation over to Jeff and John. Thanks, guys, and take it away.
Okay. Hello. I'm Jeff Kobe.
And I'm John Shackley.
And we're here today to give you an overview of careers in translation and interpreting and the background you'll need in order to become a successful translator and/or an interpreter. Now, I'm a professor of translation studies at Kent State University, where I help students become translators. I'm also ATA certified in German to English and Dutch to English translation, and I'm a professional commercial legal financial translator, although I'm only part-time at the moment.
John here. I'm an Ohio, Tennessee State Certified Court Interpreter with an MA in Translation from Kent State. I recently sat for the oral portion to become a nationally certified medical interpreter. My work days range from over-the-phone interpreting for medical and legal communities, and I also do on-site assignments in courts, jails, and manufacturing facilities.
Now, John, you're changing the slides for us today, right?
He's going to try that, yes.
All right. So first thing we'd like to do is to clarify the important difference between translation and interpreting. Although many people think of a translator as a person who provides face-to-face language mediation, that is, your TV news shows show an Iraqi official and his, quote, translator, for us, a translator creates a translation by taking a written text in one language and transferring it into a written text in another language. Translators work best by translating into their native languages, although some talented people can go the other way. When you're producing a translation, you have time as a translator to revise your text. Go back, John. To revise the text, to read it over again, to fix any spots that sound a bit strange, to look up words and concepts that aren't clear, etc. So professional translators are professional writers in their own language who create a text the way an artist might create an oil painting. You paint over anything that doesn't work until your final project is just right.
And the basic purpose of the interpreter is to facilitate understanding and communication between people who are speaking different languages. Interpreters possess a native ability in both languages, and time is the essential element that differentiates interpreters from translators. That is, the message is delivered on the spot with interpreting. Interpreters are actors, but they don't speak their own lines. They serve as a voice for others without changing or omitting anything in the message.
So you can all see our slide on the two-peak translation and interpreting iceberg. At least I hope you can. One way to think of the skills required for becoming a translator or interpreter is to visualize them as something like our iceberg. a lot of the knowledge that you need in order to be in this profession is below what we would call the minimum competency skills for a language mediator. This is what I'm calling sea level. Most of it, Iceberg, is also below sea level. And starting at the bottom of our iceberg, every language mediator needs a broad education, usually a college degree, and an interest in what's going on in the world, together with specialized subject matter knowledge. Next, of course, on the next level, professional level skill in at least one foreign language is required. Those are just the prerequisites before you can even start to think about being a translator. Knowing a foreign language is necessary, but it's not sufficient. You have to get above sea level. That is, the competence level into the visible zone of the specialized skills that we need in the profession. That is, first of all, the ability to transfer a message, an oral or a written message, from one language into another. And second, the ability to write in the target language for translators, or to speak in both languages for interpreters. There is also some overlap, since many people in the industry, at least some, do both skills, translation and interpreting. So let's go on and take a look at the details. The first skill is world knowledge or subject matter knowledge. So professional translators and interpreters work on professional level texts in professional environments. That is, this is not what you might have learned in language class as, letters to grandma or some short stories. These are real technical types of courses, or not courses, technical types of texts in the areas where people are actually willing to pay to have these texts translated or interpreted. Sciences, technology, medicine, that is, patents, cutting edge, new inventions that need to be going from one language into another. In the area of business, law, and finance, I personally am a commercial, legal, financial translator. We're talking about contracts. We're talking about lawsuits and court rulings and so forth, annual reports. This is not just basic stuff. On the interpreting side, you're going into social service agencies, working in the courts, working in hospitals. So all of these areas are specialized. And in addition, you need to know what's happening in the world around you. You need to be reading the newspaper, being aware of what the issues are in a lot of general areas. Now, how do you keep that up? You maintain your skills, and I think John's going to talk about that.
Something I learned in grad school years ago was a professor told me, try to read something in each language for a half hour every day. For example, I might look at penal codes from Argentina. I make myself read the New York Times, read specialized glossaries. For example, I deal with a lot of Puerto Rican clients, and they have a way of expressing themselves that I might not be familiar with, because there are 21 different Spanishes, and as a Spanish interpreter, I have to work at becoming familiar with what they say. So I make myself read something challenging almost every day. I go to medical websites in Spanish to learn about diseases, treatments, medications. Again, becoming familiar with regionalisms, because not everybody says the flu the same way. I read financial pages, the editorial pages. Another thing that's helped me out a great deal is reading blogs, because I actually get to see, one, people's idea of politics, and two, how people speak. Another thing I can do is, you can do if you'd like to, is listen and record a text, say in your second language, and use it for interpreting practice. And I'll talk about that later on.
All right. So let's move on to foreign language knowledge. So if you're considering a career in translation or interpreting, which is what we call the language industry, obviously the first requirement is knowing 2 languages, your native one being the first. As language professionals, translators and interpreters need to be truly superior users of their native language. This is actually more than what you would get in a college degree in a foreign language. So when you're working in your foreign language, the best thing to do is study abroad. In high school, if you have time, and certainly no later than in your college studies. So when we're developing these skills, you're developing very highly advanced skills in your foreign languages, along with very highly advanced skills in your native language. You want to develop your native language skills right along with your foreign language skills, so that you can read or listen to texts about a wide variety of very complex topics, and then write or speak about them in the other language, in the target language, with the same level of skill.
No, the B language is a language other than the interpreter's native language, of which he or she has a perfect command and into which he or she works from one or more of his other languages. Some interpret into B language in only one of the two modes of interpretation, be it consecutive or simultaneous. The B language is gained by birth and study, preferably at the university level, living in a foreign country, as Jeff mentioned, and continuous immersion. The C language is the language or languages of which the interpreter has a complete understanding and from which he or she works. Interpreters often have several C languages. Bilingual is defined as the ability to use two languages with equal or nearly equal fluency. If you're in a bilingual household, this affords you an opportunity to learn speech in a natural environment as compared to learning in an academic setting.
Remember, though, our warning about language background. Fluency in two or more languages is just the prerequisite to being a language mediator. In addition, it takes training and practice to learn to translate or interpret well. So we're going to talk about studying in order to acquire that background. So I'm going to let John talk about this because he actually studied translation.
Yes, I started out studying translation and ended up an interpreter, so don't be alarmed if you tend to go on both sides, if you will. In your handout, you're going to see a link to the ATA website where you're going to find programs available for university study, translating and interpreting, that are available all the way from Algeria to Uzbekistan. So please go to the website for links to the programs. And when you're searching out a program, look for a program that may include theory and terminology, computer applications for translators, which is a given because skilled translators today works mostly with computer-aided software. Look for localization coursework, coursework that offers you legal, commercial, literary, and scientific courses. Now, software localization is a process of translating software user interfaces from one language to another and adapting it to suit a foreign culture. My experience was I taught Spanish to get started being an interpreter. I trained as a translator at Kent, and strangely enough, at the time they offered one interpreting course, and the light turned on. It's like, this is what I want to do. So I left translating, went on to become an interpreter, became a teleinterpreter, and eventually became a state-certified court interpreter. So don't be alarmed if you start in one direction and find yourself going in the other, because that sometimes does happen.
The point to make here is that remember our iceberg. Most of the skills are in common. It's only at the peaks that we're specializing into translation or interpreting. So your language study, translation study will help you in interpreting. Interpreting study will help you in translation. Bottom line is you get that degree, study, and live abroad. If you can't go abroad, some people can't. There are also programs in the United States where you can go and spend the summer immersed in a language, and that can help you as well. Okay, moving on. Once we've got our undergraduate degree, we have to talk about the kinds of skills we need, and this is what John was talking about in the area of I've lost my train of thought. Let me start that sentence over. When he was talking about your university studies, you're gaining a certain level of skill, and you're looking for areas, special areas of study like commercial, legal, financial, medical, and so forth. But what you're actually doing by getting trained that way is we're trying to teach you in the master's degree to acquire transfer skill at the professional level, to understand the meaning of a message in the source language, which means understanding that medical text, that legal text, and then transferring it into the target language. When you're a translator, you're going to be translating as a professional writer. Translators are professional writers, and when we're translating a court ruling so that it sounds like a court ruling in the target language. We're translating a contract so it sounds like a contract in the target language. We're translating a patent so it sounds like a patent in the target language. And John's going to talk about interpreters.
Well, interpreters, they interpret at a rapid pace, and sometimes you encounter difficult language, especially with judges and lawyers who are used to speaking high-level language at a rapid pace, and you slowly become adapted to their speed. Interpreters have to render the message as intelligible to the average speaking layman without adding or omitting anything. For example, in a court setting, the interpreter's voice becomes part of the record. She must speak clearly so the court reporter, judges, attorneys can hear the witness testimony. And this occurs amidst hearing rustling papers, coughs and sneezes, doors slamming. Interpreters learn how to develop a highly sense of focus in on what is exactly it is they need to hear. We interpreters primarily work on their feet at times for extended periods, and we need to learn to take care of our instrument, which is our voice. And I do this through getting rest and plenty of water. No matter your specialization, if you're medical interpreter, technical interpreter, the message must be conveyed faithfully, as if the interpreter weren't in the room. I often tell my clients, I'm not in the room, I'm looking at my piece of paper, I'm just a voice here. One other thing that came to me in my career was I took an acting class. So if you want to get some assistance in helping to learn how to project your voice, because interpreters, if we will, are actors, it might help you build your speaking skills.
As we said, translators are professional writers, and interpreters are professional speakers, and in a sense, actors. All of us also specialize, and we'll have another slide in a minute about specialization in some of the areas we've already mentioned. And John already touched on translation tools, that is, the technical resources that have been developed to assist you in translation. Now, let me clarify that this is not machine translation. This is not Google Translate. That's a risk you take definitely at your own risk. No, professional translators use tools in order to improve their own translations. They don't let the machine do it. So moving on to specialization, our clients expect that we are competent in specific subject areas. Now, professional translators generally specialize in two main areas with some subspecialties. Scientific, technical, and medical texts are usually cutting-edge developments in the field. So formal study in these areas is useful, along with that constant reading that John mentioned earlier. Business, legal, and financial texts are things like business plans, contracts, lawsuits, annual financial statements, and the like, along with presentations about business for a number of different audiences. This also requires keeping up with the latest changes in laws and regulations in your industry. Third, literary translation is possibly the hardest type of translation, since it requires translation of cultural ideas and nuances. It's a different kind of translation than the other more commercial kinds, and it may not be as lucrative in the short run. There's even a separate organization for that called the American Literary Translation Associations, or ALTA, ALTA. John?
Medical interpreters. I became a medical interpreter after I became a legal interpreter. There are two different fields. Starting with medical, a medical interpreter has several roles he or she plays. He serves as a conduit, he clarifies, he may step out of his role as interpreter, be a cultural broker or an advocate. He may interpret consent forms, explain complex surgical procedures, be familiar with drug and alcohol terminology. For example, this morning over the phone I was explaining, I think it was a sigmoidoscopy to a patient. So you become familiar with that type of terminology. Shifting over to legal, legal runs the gamut from highly formalized legal language to drug slang, including profanity. For example, if I have a person in court that swears like a sailor, I, the interpreter, in order to produce a faithful rendition, will swear or say exactly what he says. So some might say interpreting isn't for the people who, you can't dress up somebody's language if they're using vulgar language. Conference interpreting, you may find yourself interested in engineering and sciences and business. For example, I learned a lot of scientific terminology when interpreting for a major soap manufacturer. They brought up businessmen from South America, so we had to explain to them the basic parts of the soap, how it was manufactured. I had another assignment which involved offset printing technology. Now, I didn't know anything at all about printing, but through research, I have to tell you it was really cool to be right beside the engineers and the machinists who assembled piece by piece this equipment that was going to be shipped off to foreign soil. So that's part of the advantage of being an interpreter. You're right on site, and you're right in the middle of it. Jeff?
Okay. Yep. Let's move on to the next slide and talk about the actual careers. What can you do and have a translation career? We'll talk about interpreting a little bit later. Some of your career options. Freelance translator, in-house translator, project manager, software localizer, terminologist, or subtitler. And I'm sure there are more, but these are the main ones. And so this is just a summary slide. We're going to go right on to the next slide. And this is one I inserted this morning because I know this question is going to come along. Can I make a living as a translator? Now, that isn't the subject of our talk today. Our talk is more about how to get there. But the basic answer that you want to hear is, yes, you can make a living. And I think John will concur on that. Right, John?
Yes, I was going to say I've been able to pay my rent, have health insurance, take vacations. I don't feel like I'm going through life without because I chose this field. So you can make a good living.
Right. The most important factors in surviving in the business is that you have high quality translation or interpreting, which means your message is being conveyed accurately, and speed for translators is a variable. The more you can translate in an hour, the more money you will make. In interpreting, of course, you have to make sure that you're translating at the speed of speech. So those factors said, the translation and interpreting compensation survey from the ATA is purchasable online. We're not going to talk any more about the actual money you can make. We're going to go right on and talk about what you can do. So on the next slide, we'll talk about being a freelance translator. According to the compensation survey, 80% of translators today are freelance translators. That is, of those who responded to the survey. 52% of them are full-time freelance translators, 28% part-time. Now, the advantages of being a freelance translator is you can work from home. You set your own hours. You wear your pajamas to work if you so choose, your bunny slippers, and whatever. You set your own hours, which means if your best working time is midnight to 6 a.m., you tell your clients when they can call you. Often you're working with translation agencies in other time zones, so that's not a problem. And set your own hours, work in your own environment. You can take breaks. You can go pick up your kids at school. You can just adjust your schedule around your work as long as you make your deadlines. You can also turn down jobs you don't like. You can always look at a job when it's offered to you before accepting it. If it's a topic you don't like or not comfortable with, or if you simply choose to translate contracts and not financial documents, you can say that. It does, however, need self-discipline. I had a graduate of our program went out as a freelance translator and said, gee, but my soap opera is on at 11 o'clock. And so she would fritter away her time. You have to give yourself self-discipline, set your hours, and sit down and buckle down and work. And so people who work to deadlines work very well as freelance translators. Your clients can be either translation agencies, which themselves go out and gather the work from direct clients, and they aggregate it, they send it to you, or you can develop direct clients, that is, companies in various industries that need translation. Either way is fine. Many translators work with a mix of those. The challenge here is that you are an independent entrepreneur. You are a small business person, and you have all of the risks and all of the opportunities of being an entrepreneur. John, any comments on the freelance translator?
Yeah, just a quick one. I'd like to give a shout out to Courtney Ridge, who was my ATA mentor. That one of the best pieces of advice she ever gave me was, John, make sure you have a regular source of income before you go into another field. For example, I think I was teaching at the same time I was interpreting, so I made sure I had money coming in, and ideally you'd have 3 months worth of income set aside to tide you over in between jobs. So if you're getting into the field, don't be alarmed if you can't get right into it 100%. Make sure you have some kind of money coming in, eventually work your way into, like I did, I'm a full-time interpreter now.
Yeah, John's quite right about that. When I started as a freelance translator, the first year I made $5,000. You obviously can't live on that. But over 2 to 3 years, I started making enough money to then, theoretically, if I didn't work at the university, abandon my day job and go and do what's really fun, which is translation. So let's move on to the next possibility. You can be an in-house translator. 12% of translators, according to the survey, are in-house translators, 9% full-time, 3% part-time. The advantage of this is you work in an office, you have regular hours. You may have a salary rather than having your income fluctuate based on how much you translated that week. You translate what's assigned. That may be a downside because you may be translating stuff you're not interested in. But on the other hand, when you're done at 5 o'clock, you're done at 5 o'clock. Now, the in-house translator works in a translation agency in some cases where the translation agency has enough volume in that language pair. That is often the case in the majority languages. So translation agency that specializes in Spanish to English translation may have some in-house Spanish to English translators. But in other languages, there's plenty of opportunities in a wide variety of languages, but they're not necessarily full-time. Another place to work is in industry. The large multinational companies think immediately of Microsoft, which ships its software products in a variety of languages simultaneously. Somebody's translating that, and we hope it's a highly skilled professional, and it usually is. Microsoft, Caterpillar Tractor are just two examples of companies that have large enough volumes of foreign business that they actually maintain in-house translators who do some of their work. And of course, another advantage of being an in-house translator is you don't have to be being an entrepreneur and arranging for your own health insurance and benefits and vacations, etc. Comments on in-house, John?
No, I can pass.
All right, let's go on to the project manager. A project manager doesn't necessarily even have to be trained as a translator, but many of our graduates at Kent State go into the language industry wanting a job, and many of the entry-level jobs in the language industry are project managers. You're not necessarily translating. Instead, you're working in an office with regular hours, which may be different hours than you think. I've seen project manager jobs where the hours are midnight to 9 a.m. or something like that because of the different time zones you're working with. But you have regular hours, you have translations that come in from your clients, and you're on the phone or on email to freelance translators assigning translations to them to be translated or to be edited. You may have a quality control role. So you're at the hub of the translation industry, but you may not be actually translating yourself, although you probably are better off with some language facility so that you can recognize what language a translation is in. Sometimes that's an issue. This has some training that goes with it. There's project manager training. Linguistic project managers have to manage their linguists and manage projects so that they go through a series of deadlines so that they're delivered to the client on time. You work in a translation agency, generally, and of course you get benefits. I'm going to go right on unless John interrupts me, so let's go on to the next slide, which is software localizer. Now, John mentioned this briefly on a previous slide. A software localizer is a translator. So I'm waiting for the slide to switch here. Software localization is translation of software interfaces. That is, all of the menu items, the help files, the online documentation, the little pop-up boxes that come up. That has some special challenges to it. Now, this can be part of a freelance translator's job, as it shows on the slide. Usually you're going to be at home because it's one of those freelance kinds of jobs, but it is specialized. You're manipulating the text from the software. You may be changing the size of text boxes. You may be doing other adjustments to menu items and hotkeys and things like that. So it's translation plus software. The more you know about software programming and the more you can handle specialized file formats and like the technical side of interfacing language with computers, the more happy you will be as a software localizer. Again, since you're generally a freelance translator, you're at home, and your entrepreneurial risks and opportunities are the same as any other freelance translator. Moving on to the next big area, and this is another language-related or translation-related job, the terminologist. A terminologist, as the definition says, is someone who studies the system of terms belonging to any particular area. Now, a terminologist in the translation industry isn't just studying it. The terminologist is actually creating terminologies. These are not just lists. You're familiar with glossaries where you have one term in German and another term in English. That's just a glossary. A terminology entry involves research and documentation. What is the definition of this term? What is the correct equivalent in maybe not just German and English, but if you're talking about Microsoft, for instance, they may need that term for button in a software program in French, German, Spanish, Italian, Russian, Chinese, and any number of other languages. So the terminologist makes sure that all of those terms are accurate, that they're used that way in that country, documents this in a special terminology management program, and this is essentially creating a resource. The terminologist working in-house in a company or an organization is, I'm thinking international organization like the UN or the World Health Organization, for instance, or the European Union. They are creating these terms as accurate and definitive equivalents across languages, which then are used by all of the translators in that organization and even outside for consistency in translation. In our handout, there's also a link to the Microsoft glossaries in various languages and also to the European Union's terminology database, which anyone can use. So there's another terminologist, another translation-related linguistic job opportunity. Now last here among the translation areas is that of the subtitler. Subtitlers are those people who translate the text of what is actually spoken dialogue on the screen on a film into another language, and many of you or most of you will have seen this. In the lower part of the screen you have subtitles so that you can watch a foreign movie. The translator has a real challenge here because the speech is much longer than what you can fit into the space at the bottom of the screen. You can't translate every word. You have to translate, condense, and distill to get the essence of the action expressed in words. Since every subtitle generally has to stay on the screen for 2 seconds, and an awful lot of words can be said in 2 seconds, you can see what kind of tight space and time restrictions they have. And as I'll let John take a little bit more comments on this because I think he's done some.
Yeah, I didn't realize when I became an interpreter that I had this voice that people like to hear. So what happened to me is somebody said, why don't you try voice acting? And a voice actor is somebody who provides dialogue for, say, training films or other media. So in my experience as an interpreter, I've also done films for training how to use a washing machine, or this is the way that you do your things when you in the Spanish. And it's really kind of fun because for a few moments I feel like I'm a rock star. I've got the headset on, I'm in the studio, and if somebody does tell you you do have a voice for this type of thing, please pursue it because the pay is good, it's demanding, and it's a tight little niche audience. But if you've got a voice that can carry to people that you may not be aware of, please look into it. And again, I refer back to our handout. There's a book by a fellow named Iceberg that can help you get started about being a voice actor. If you want to contact me offline another time, I can give you my further experiences. But so keep yourself open because you may find yourself both interpreting and voice acting and translating.
Right, and just to finish off this slide, subtitlers are working at home. They're using specialized software. They get a digital copy of their movie, and they are actually using special software to actually insert the subtitles right on this. Whereas voice actors, I've actually done this too. I spent one whole morning in the basement of a recording studio where they had their sound booth in the middle of a blizzard, but it was a great place to spend the morning. John, it's your turn to talk about interpreting.
Okay, an interpreter interprets what he or she hears in the same language level or register in which it's stated, no matter of the listener's ability to understand the concepts involved. And there's a delay between when an interpreter hears a thought and the moment she renders that thought in the second language. This is known as a décalage, or time lag. Interpreters interpret thoughts rather than words, or better said, the underlying meaning. You can practice shadowing, which is where you listen to your B language and you say word for word what the speaker is saying in the same language. By doing this, and I do this driving down the road when I listen to Sirius radio, I'll listen to the CNN in Spanish and I'll say the same thing they're saying. This improves my pronunciation, enunciation, and speed, and invariably I learn new words. You can use consecutive interpreting. You have on the screen simultaneous, consecutive, and escort. Talking about consecutive, in a court setting, that's using a witness testimony. Like I have to hear what somebody says and translate it into, or interpret into the other language. You also use your consecutive interpreting if you are a medical interpreter for doctor's visits or when you interpret for someone in the emergency room. A point to remember about interpreting is you remember chunks of information and you recast that into the target language.
John, can you move the slide on, please? Can you move the slide on one? Yeah, that's okay.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, listeners. Escort interpreting. This includes business people, diplomats, or artists, where the interpreter whispers into the B or the target language. And maybe a company owner wants to bring salesmen up on a factory tour to explain their products and manufacturing. And the interpreter has to follow along to keep the constant flow of information to the person who's hearing whatever it is the speaker is saying. Moving on to other interpreting skills, sight translation. This is just as difficult as simultaneous translation, and you have the same mental processes. You have to read something, understand it, and be able to put it into the B language, while at the same time you're processing the next A language thought and so on. Delivery for interpreters is important when you're a sight translator because you have to speak loudly and enunciate clearly, remembering that yours are the only words that the party is going to be hearing. And it's supposed to sound exactly as if an interpreter were reading a document in the B language. For example, I had to read a witness victim statement of a young lady that had been the victim of a rape. And so when I read her witness statement to the court, I didn't read it in a monotone. I had to put a little bit of drama into it, but not too much. In the legal forum, there might be a foreign language recording that you want to introduce as evidence, and you have to have a transcript prepared by a tape transcriber. And there are real stringent requirements to become a tape transcriber, because if you have an inaccurate or a sloppy or incomplete document, the value drops. So the bilingual person who is a transcriptor, what you do is a word-for-word transcript of all language in the original recording and the corresponding translation into English. Then you do a dual language transcript. You have to know about register, regional variants in both languages, beware of idioms. Rule of thumb is if someone asks you to do a transcription, the next words out of your mouth are, it takes approximately 1 hour to produce 1 minute of a recording. And you have to have a highly tuned perceptive ear, have excellent writing skills in both English and the foreign language and research skills. And when you're taking notes, everybody has their own language used for note-taking. Focus on writing just what you need. For heaven's sakes, don't write down the entire sentence. Focus on keywords, chunks, or numbers and names especially. So most interpreters that I work with always have a tablet in hand because you never know when somebody's going to say a name or a number, and you have to make sure you get it right. The code of ethics, everyone develops their own code of ethics as far as being an interpreter. The difference between, let me talk about the difference between legal and medical interpreting. Legal is adversarial and medical is collaborative, whereby in medical interpreting, the patient's needs are first. A legal interpreter can't step out of his or her role as an interpreter, and we can't advocate for the non-English speaking person. I can't say, Your Honor, you aren't treating this person carefully. I have to stay inside of my role. As compared to medical interpreter, we can advocate if the patient's the victim of a continuous abuse in the system. Back to legal. In legal, we have our ethics. We have to be accurate. We don't omit. We have to be impartial. We don't show any conflict of interest. We don't have any unnecessary contact with the parties. The rule of thumb with interpreters, if there are 2 people there, I'm not interpreting. If there are 3 people there, I'm in the role of the interpreter. Confidentiality. I can't disclose any information that I've heard on a job without authorization. I just interpret. I don't give advice. I use the same person as the speaker. I always update my skills and go to workshops. I also only let people know what I can and can't do. I continue my certification. I just went to a workshop at the Ohio Supreme Court on idioms. And I have to let people know when I can't do my job. If I can't hear, if I don't know the terminology, or if somebody says something I can't understand, I have to turn to my client and say, Your Honor, the interpreter requested clarification, because my job is to get the right word out. Moving on to medical ethics, same categories: accuracy, confidentiality, cultural awareness. Say if you're working with a provider that asks the patient who's fasting for religious reasons to take an oral medication, the interpreter may step out of the role just interpreting and call attention to the potential conflict, in essence advocating for the patient. You can speak. The reason you speak out is to protect the individual from serious harm. For example, I may, as an interpreter, intervene on behalf of the patient with a life-threatening allergy if the condition has been overlooked, because as a medical interpreter, you're sitting with the client before the doctor comes in. So if he tells you something that's life-threatening, I want to make sure that that comes up during the interpreting session. Moving on to translator certification. Jeff, did you want to get started on this?
Well, actually, let me speak to ethics just a minute. The translator ethics are a little bit different because we're talking about written texts. The ATA Code of Ethics talks about faithful, accurate, and impartial translations. And one of the most interesting things about this is when we're talking about translation, I, for instance, have had certifications of ethical practice that say, I will not translate anything into the target language that is libelous, slanderous, or otherwise, actionable. You could be sued, unless it's already in the original source text. The translator must be impartial and translate everything accurately. That's essentially the bottom line. Now, about certification, and we'll keep this brief because we want to keep some time for questions. There is certification through the ATA certification committee that is doing 24-odd language pairs. Other countries also offer certification, the ITI in England, and there's an Australian certification. There are other countries that offer certification. ATA offers 10 languages into English, and from English into 14 languages. Many of them, of course, are the same. Certification is not required in order for you to work in the translation industry. Certification says that you are able to produce high-quality work independently. You may find that if you become certified, you will find that you get more work or more challenging work. The work may be in topics that you're more interested in, and it may pay better if you are recognized as a top-level translator. Unless you have the ability to produce what is really high-quality, accurate translation into the target language, you're not going to continue to make a living in translation. Let's move on to interpreters. John?
As far as interpreter certification goes, I'll be brief. On the hand, you have some links here to get information on becoming a certified medical interpreter, a legal interpreter, either federal or the state level. Let me just say this quickly. Please consider becoming certified, because what that does is you set yourself apart from others. You're raising the level of professionalism, and as I can put a plug here for Ohio. Here in Ohio in 2013 in January, the law is going into effect in the courts where they'll have to be mandated to use certified interpreters. So you help everybody else out when you become interpreting.
One last comment on one last comment on certification. While it is a benefit to become certified, I have to warn you that the pass rate on certification exams is not super high. I know the federal court interpreter certification pass rate is less than 20%. The ATA translator certification pass rate is less than 20%. It's not designed for beginners. It's designed for people with some experience who are really capable of doing the high-level translation or interpreting. So that concludes our presentation. Thank you very much, and we'll move on to the last slide, and we'll be happy to take your questions now for the next few minutes.
Thank you very much, John and Jeff. We do have one or two questions. The first one that came in is asking how essential is it for a translator to use CAT tools? That's one for Jeff, I think.
Well, okay. The more and more translation texts are coming in as electronic texts. That is, the clients are expecting you to translate the text and return it in electronic form as a Word file or a PDF or a PowerPoint or whatever format it comes in as. But not all clients are using CAT tools themselves. So it's not absolutely essential for you to own the tool or use the tool. There's a wide variety of different tools out there at different price ranges. There are many, many clients and many, many texts that do not lend themselves to the use of CAT tools, or the client simply doesn't care whether you do or not. I take an electronic text of any kind. I always run it through my CAT tool because it remembers everything I've translated, and I can go back and look it up. But it's certainly absolutely not essential.
Okay, here's a question that we can actually expand on a little bit. Wendy wants to know how you become trained to be a terminologist, but actually that sort of applies to all of the different careers that you've mentioned. Is there a special, once you become a translator or interpreter, how do you specialize?
Well, those are two different questions, really. Terminologist is a field that I think you mostly wander into through translator training. We, for instance, at Kent State, and I think many other institutions, offer specific courses on terminology management as part of the training to be a translator. And that kind of specialization is a matter of, is your interest in actually transferring text as messages, or doing the research on the concepts and developing these terminology databases. You can actually go and study terminology in some places, but not in the United States. The other question is, how do you specialize? And that's really, how do you specialize outside of translation, that is, outside of the linguistic field? How do you translate, how do you become a translator of legal texts or financial texts or medical texts? Now, there's two ways to go about that. Some people come to the translation industry having already studied some other field. They're lawyers, they're biochemists, or whatever, and they decide that they have an interest in language. That's one way. For those of us who, like myself, are linguists first, some formal study or informal study is necessary to develop that knowledge. Reading law, for instance. You can, at many institutions, you can study pre-law or paralegal studies. You can take a business minor or a business degree. You can do this as formal study, or you can simply decide, okay, I'm going to become, as one of our graduates once did, the printing queen, and so she started attending conferences in that industry. And so she, even though she was not a printer, she went to printing conferences. She looked at the displays of the latest technology in printing, and she would ask very interested questions and get all the diagrams she could. And so you can develop this kind of skill in a subject area also informally by knowing how to develop a range of knowledge in a certain area.
Thank you. We have Elizaveta here who has a lot of qualifications. She has an interpreting degree from Russia, BA in economics and geography from an American college, working in healthcare sales right now in the US, and would like to do a bit of freelance translating on the side. I don't mean a bit of. Would like to do freelance translating on the side. Have you any advice as to the best way to go about that?
Step one, join the American Translators Association. And the reason I say that is not just for advertising, but because that allows you to start networking and making contacts. If you want to become a freelance translator today, you need to get your resume into the hands of as many translation agencies as possible. That is, you can locate them online. You can locate them in the online directory at the ATA website of translation companies. You can also, as a member of the ATA, put your resume, your profile up in the directory, and people can find you as an ATA member on that site. But essentially, you're starting as a freelance translator, you're starting a small business, you're going to go out and market yourself by putting your information into as many translation agency forms. You can find online forms to fill out. You can send people resumes. Get your name out there, and people will then identify your qualifications and call you back.
Great. Specialization is pretty hard. We need some more questions, so please send them in. We've got a few more. Is certification from another country really going to work in the U.S.?
I think so. The point of certification is to distinguish yourself in the marketplace as someone who is a professional who cares about accuracy. And so the ATA certification is the most recognized credential in the United States, and it's actually quite useful overseas as well. But a client seeing that you're certified by NAATI of Australia or ITI Certified Translator of England is going to be seeing that, I think, as an equivalent qualification. I also have to say, in all fairness, that these are not necessarily reciprocal qualifications, but, for instance, holding a certification from a foreign country I believe automatically allows you to take it qualifies you as one of the eligibility criteria that allows you to take the ATA certification exam without any other further qualifications.
I have a question here for John.
Yes?
Hang on, I've lost it for a second. This is a question from someone who's working in the medical field, interested in getting into medical interpretation. Interpreting. How do I start? Is there a way to find out what specialization area in translating and interpreting? Sorry, I've gone on to the next question. End the question at how do I start? Sorry about that.
How do you start? One way to start out in medical interpreting is to find out if your local hospitals already have an interpreting services program. If so, you might look into it. I started volunteering at the hospital, and eventually they started hiring people to interpret. So that's one of the ways to get started. I can't stress how important it is to find out local organizations, like we have Northeast Ohio Translator Association here in Ohio. Join a local group, go to a workshop, start listening to, we used to listen to ER, watch ER on television. Start watching medical shows on TV. Tape them if you must. Start interpreting them as you're sitting there with your cup of coffee late at night, and just start doing it. And also, I would encourage you to take a look at our handout, because there are there's a couple books you might look into purchasing. Corinne McKay has a book on being a freelance translator. Chris Durbin has a book on being a prosperous translator. The point is, it's important to develop a business plan, because we interpreters and translators are freelancers, entrepreneurs. You find out how to market yourself. I would just, forgive me for saying this, but just dive in and start doing it. And again, if you can contact me, and I'd be glad to talk further about this, but I would just tell you, just find out locally where are the programs, volunteer your time, and get started.
So we have time for one more question, but please do send your questions in.